Everywhere you go, it seems people are talking about the cost of living, including grocery prices. But not so many of us are talking about the cost of producing those groceries. Many might be shocked to learn that foreign workers on Australian farms have been left with as little as $100 in their pay packets after a week picking fruit. Talk about a lack of wage growth. Agriculture Minister David Littleproud was recently asked if it was appropriate that workers who'd moved to Australia to work on farms be left with such low wages after their employers made deductions for costs such as airfares, accommodation and visas. The minister said it wasn't appropriate and that a small cohort of labour hire firms that were doing the wrong thing must be held to account. Our job is to weed them out, Mr. Littleproud said. But it doesn't appear to be a small cohort, and it has been allowed to happen under the Australian government's very own labour hire scheme. The government's seasonal worker program sets no limit to the amount of money an employer can deduct from a worker's pay for costs incurred as part of that employment. Major labour hire firm Madec, a not-for-profit charity, is an approved employer under the SWP, which is merging with the Pacific Labour Scheme, and will be known as the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme. It made headlines when its chief executive Lawrence Burt told a recent Senate inquiry that Madec takes hundreds of dollars of deductions from a worker's weekly pay to cover expenses such as airfares, visas, accommodation, cash advances, and other on-arrival expenses. While certain costs linked to the worker's arrival in Australia were recovered in the initial months of employment, other deductions have continued weekly for living costs such as accommodation, transport, and health insurance. The seasonal worker program brings Pacific and Timorese workers to Australia for up to 9 months. Wages wiped out. The inquiry into job security heard of several occasions when workers were left with $100 in their weekly checks after deductions. The deductions, sometimes worth more than $600 a week, appear to be in accordance with the government's guidelines. Mr. Burt told the ABC that Madec was fully compliant with SWP and Fair Work guidelines, and that it had set the $100 per week minimum for the workers' net wages. In their first few weeks in Australia, or if they work a low number of hours that week, costs can amount to all of a casual worker's weekly wages, which is why Madec has guaranteed its workers a minimum of $100 in the hand per week, he said. This guarantee has been accepted by the government prior to a worker's commitment. Mr. Burt said salary deduction was the only method of cost recovery permitted by the government. Madec does not add any margin to the cost of these services, he said. There is no government guidance regarding how quickly these costs can be recovered or any minimum weekly payment requirement for casual workers. Mr. Burt said Madec, which employed more than 3,800 SWP workers over the past 2 years, had lifted its minimum weekly payment to $200 per week. He said that over the duration of their employment, Madec's casual workers averaged a $620 per week take-home wage after tax, accommodation, health insurance, transport and travel costs. A recent inquiry heard Aliki was left with just $100 in weekly wages after his employer made deductions for costs incurred as part of his employment. Here to work for money. But for Samoan worker Aliki, who gave evidence at the Senate inquiry last month, there were at least 3 weeks in late 2021 when Madec's deductions left him with just $100 to take home from work on a Victorian strawberry farm. Aliki told the inquiry he had parents, a wife and 8 children, and expected he'd be sending much more money home. He begged the senators to act so he could better his conditions and send more money back to his family. Another worker, Sergio, told the inquiry he had also received wages of $100 a week for work on a grape farm at Mildura. I came here to work for money, he told the inquiry. I did not come here as a slave. While workers must sign off on the costs, it's not clear how many workers on the scheme are met with similar pay packets, or possibly receive even less take-home pay because of deductions. What is clear is that this is not a great look as the Australian government scrambles to find another country to its new agriculture visa. The visa was promised on the sidelines of Australia's trade deal with the UK last year, and so far no country has agreed to participate. While the Nationals heralded it as a win for the junior coalition partner, it is yet to deliver another set of boots on the ground. As far as the Nationals are concerned, it's up to Foreign Minister Marise Payne to announce a deal before the election is called. Industry sources have told the ABC they expect more details on Tuesday, the day the federal government hands down its pre-election budget. Ms. Payne also has oversight of the PALM, now administered by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. M to mute, left and right arrows to seek, up and down arrows for volume. Watch 2 minutes 23 seconds 2 minutes and 23 seconds Slavery hasn't finished calls to improve Australia's seasonal worker scheme. No deduction limit. The federal government's guidelines for approved employers, updated in September 2021, make it clear there is no limit on weekly deductions or minimum take-home pay. You will ensure seasonal workers have sufficient funds each week to meet reasonable costs of living, the guidelines state. Some approved employers set a minimum net pay for this purpose. Some, but not all. There are more than 300 approved employers on the PALM. You must ensure that seasonal workers have sufficient income after paying tax and deductions to live on each week, and over the period of their stay in Australia, to derive a reasonable net financial benefit, the guidelines state. If you are unable to demonstrate that the seasonal workers will receive a reasonable net financial benefit, your recruitment application will not be approved. The Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme is expected to bring tens of thousands of workers from the Pacific to work in Australia. So what is reasonable? Like Mr. Littleproud, Labor Senator Tony Sheldon says workers being left with $100 a week is not on. We're seeing deductions where people have been charged for linen, whilst at the same time paying $150 each with 3 other people in a room, $600 total a week for rent, he said. This is a system completely out of control. Senator Sheldon, who chaired the Job Security Inquiry, said it was not just one labour hire firm leaving workers with little take-home pay after deductions, and that no Australian worker would expect to be working like that. DFAT have an obligation to make sure they are reasonable costs, but the costs put on these workers is outrageously wrong, he said. A spokesperson for DFAT says it has assurance mechanisms to ensure deductions are legitimate and employer obligations are met, and that it is investigating reports about Pacific workers' pay. The government is focused on getting the settings right for workers, employers and sending countries, the spokesperson said. There are tens of thousands of foreign workers in Australia on the government scheme taking up jobs that few Australians want. Without them, it's unlikely Australia's $12 billion horticulture sector would be worth what it is today. If one minister thinks it's not appropriate that workers are left with such little take-home pay, it is his government that can change the rules.